All right, Genesis 21, 22 through 34. Today we're just going to consider this last story in Genesis 21. There are sort of three stories that you find in this chapter: the birth of Isaac, and then the expulsion, the removal, the banishment of Ishmael and Hagar with him, and then this treaty with this Philistine king, Abimelech. And that's where we are this time. It probably doesn't sound super interesting to any of us. You know, we're going to read about this time that Abraham and Abimelech made a treaty, and it's just kind of material that's here that we got to get through, is probably the way we often think of it. That's kind of been a theme as we've gone through some of these stories of Abraham, we kind of go through these accounts and try to we feel like we're doing good if we just understand something of what was happening. And we're not, because of that, we're selling ourselves short and really missing the real lessons that are there for us. And there are some important ones here in this text as well, though it may not seem like it at first read or at 10th read, but they're there. And so I want to do my best again to bring these out for us. Think of this now. This is the last story we have about God dealing with Abraham before we see Abraham commanded by God to offer up his son Isaac as a burnt offering. That's kind of significant. If I didn't tell you it was a treaty between Abraham and Abimelech, but I told you we're going to read the final story, the story that kind of sets the stage for what Abraham is like and how he's relating to God and what kind of man he is right before God commands him to do this. I think all of our ears would perk up and we'd say, well, I want to know about that story, what's going on. And it's a big letdown to think it's a treaty between him and this guy that he had lied to before, and the guy didn't really trust him, and it just seems strange that this would be the case. We know he's getting ready to face one of the greatest and most difficult tests of his faith and of his willingness to obey the Lord in his entire life. And the scene we have today is the last time we see Abraham before that trial. At the same time, I hope you've come to realize and to see that in all the stories we've seen from Abraham so far, we've seen a man who is a man, first of all. He becomes something of a hero of the faith, but he is a man. He was a pagan, out-and-out pagan before God called him, and he's come from there, and he gets to the place in here in Genesis 22 where he's obeying God no matter what, trusting in God's promises. And it's been a real process. It's been 2 steps forward and 1 step back, kind of all the way through. We've seen some low points that I trust many of us are very thankful that until now we've never sunk as low as Abraham has sunk, as we've seen him get in some of these times. And then we've seen some wonderful things from him too. And so it's a real mixed bag, and that's familiar territory for us all. But this is what we've seen. But again, the arrow has been in the upward direction. He's been improving. He's been growing. Just as Scripture says, he grew strong in faith. And this is what we've seen in the main, that as we keep turning pages, in general, this man Abraham is growing in faith and in godliness and in his love for the Lord and his confidence in the Lord. Now, so Abraham is growing in faith and his obedience to God, and we see God slowly and faithfully fulfilling his promises. Now, this particular passage today, I think many of us have probably read this passage as sort of a strange story about Abimelech and this well of water. But we need to remind ourselves that there are actually very few stories that have been preserved for us to learn about the life of Abraham and God's dealings with him. And so every one of them is important. They bear real weight. They tell us much about what's been going on. And so we need to think about it that way. Don't read this text when you read it on your own and just kind of think, well, this is a story about, just about things that happened in Abraham's life. You should be asking instead, what is this text teaching me about Abraham and God's dealings with him and the fulfillment of all these things God has promised him? Where are we on that trajectory? Where are we along the lines of God taking Abraham and teaching him about righteousness and godliness and preparing a man to be able to instruct his children after him to keep the way of the Lord? Where do I see this happening? Those are the kinds of questions we want to ask. And if we come to the text asking those sorts of questions, we're able to read it rightly. So we want to get our agenda for this text not from, curious minds of the 21st century, but rather from the text itself. What has the Scriptures taught me I ought to be seeing in Abraham's life at this time? And then ask those questions of the passage. So here we are. That's what I want to do today. We'll have to learn a little bit about what's happening in the chapter first as we go through, but really we're not just trying to get clear on the facts, right? We want to consider the significance of the story. So before we dive in, let's pray, and then I will read the passage and we'll work our way through it. Scott, would you pray? All right. Verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal kindly with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham approved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. All right. Well, what do we say? First of all, this first phrase here, at that time. We can say at what time? Well, at the time when Isaac was weaned, at the time when Ishmael was sent away, at that time is when this happened. Right? At that time. If you look in chapter 21, earlier in the chapter, verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. In other words, so Abraham is outside of Gerar, and outside of Gerar, that's kind of the land is, you can have pasture land there and things like that, but it's not great. But if you dig some wells, you may be able to get by. And Abraham's out there and he's dug a well, and later the place where he dug a well is called Beersheba. Where Hagar and Ishmael went out was out into the wilderness, out even further than that, where it's even harder. That's where they went. This is where he is. And this is the time. He'd sent her out, and she's gone off there out into the wilderness. And Abraham is in this place. He's outside of Gerar, this Philistine city where Abimelech is king. And it's quite a thing. This is roughly, probably about 4 years after Abraham and Abimelech had their exchange before. You can think of it that way. God had told Abraham, about a year from now, Sarah's going to have a child. She's going to have a son. This will be its name. And right after God told him that, Abraham went with the Philistines, and this whole thing happened there with Abimelech, where he lied to him about Sarah, and Sarah was taken in as a wife, and that whole scene. And then now we're even after, so then that was found out. Sarah was returned to Abraham. They had a child, and then this child is weaned, which we're told is, or scholars tell us, is probably about 3 years of age. So this is about 4 years later. Now, that's one thing about this time. We're talking about 4 years after their last encounter, roughly. One other thing I want to say about this, about the text as a whole, before we kind of work our way through it a little more properly, is that if you read the ESV, it's the only translation which I think kind of opens the door to this possibility. It's the only English translation I've seen it done this way, and I want to caution you against it. The ESV doesn't make you read it this way, but you might read it this way if you're just reading the ESV. And you might think that we have here in verses 22 through 34 two meetings between these two men. You might think Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do, and he wants this oath to be sworn that Abraham will be truthful. And verse 24 says, and Abraham said, I will swear. And then you might read verse 25 as another time marker. Now, when Abraham, like as though when some other time, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water, you might think we're talking about two different meetings, but actually it's one meeting. And the other translations generally just say, they might say, but Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water. That contrasting word is not there. That's no reason to translate it as but either. Both translations are just trying to just get on to the next thing that happened. It's literally just, and Abraham said, I will swear. Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that his servants had seized. And so he just jumps right in. So it's from one thing to the other. Abraham says, I'll swear, and then he has some news. Listen, you have some men who have done some things. And so the exchange is all in the same context. And I can prove that to you just by looking down at verse 32. So, this is in conclusion, they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. So, they came out to Abraham to speak to him outside of their town where he was, to go speak to him and make this covenant and this agreement. And then, once everything was settled, they went back. So it's all one meeting. So I just want to make that clear. If you don't see them as one meeting, you will misunderstand the nature of what happens in the text. And so I just want to make that clear. So then, let's just consider these first couple verses 22 through 24. It says, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army. Again, this is now the third time that Abimelech and Abraham have had direct dealings. In the first instance, think about it, we need to set the stage here. The first time they met, Abraham and Sarah both lied to Abimelech about not being married. Right? They said, no, she's my sister. And Abimelech later tells us that Sarah lied to him too. They both lied, directly lied to him about their situation. This was motivated by a desire for self-preservation. It demonstrated a real lack of faith in God on Abraham's part. I mean, he did not He wasn't trusting God for protection and provision. It was wrong, it was sinful, and it cost the house of Abimelech and many of those who were with him. It caused them to fall ill, to be unable to give birth to children, or even to conceive. We talked about kind of that scene, what would it have been like later when Abraham was called to account for what he had done, and very likely the bloodshed that had happened in the house of Abimelech as pregnant mothers, gave birth to stillborn children, and this sort of a thing. So it was a real plague, it was a real tragedy that happened. This was the first time that they met. Now, not only did Abraham fail to bring blessing to the Philistines who had organized themselves under Abimelech, but he had in fact brought a great sin upon them and a plague from God. So Abraham's first encounter with Abimelech is, here, let me bring this great sin upon you and this plague from God. This is their encounter and their dealings with Abraham. It's terrible. But then, a month or so later, Abimelech calls Abraham to him again, and they have a second meeting. And what does Abimelech do? Well, we read in chapter 20, verse 8, or verse 9 rather, then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech also said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Right? And Abraham says, I did this because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And he goes on. So this is the second encounter. Abimelech rebukes Abraham for his actions. Abraham had lied. Sarah had lied. They had brought on the kingdom a great sin, things that ought not to be done. This is how Abraham was treating people, in ways that ought not be done. Thankfully, though, God had preserved the physical integrity of Sarah, though she was in Abimelech's house. He kept Abimelech from knowing her in that way. That's partly what this plague was all about. Nonetheless, there was a stinging rebuke that was made to Abraham about the lies that he had told. So these are their two encounters. The first one, he does lie and brings upon him, as a result of Sarah coming in the house, they have all this plague and tragedy for everyone who's under Abimelech's charge. And then the second time, Abimelech comes and just rebukes him outright. And this is the way it goes. And he sees Abraham kind of equivocating and saying, well, but she kind of is my sister, and it wasn't a whole lie. Sorry that all these people, these little children weren't born, and sorry that, you guys can't conceive, and sorry for the plague upon your physical bodies. But, it's kind of a half-truth. I mean, it's unbelievable that this is the way that Abraham is responding. And so we're not too impressed, and we can see why Abimelech might want to go out to Abraham and say, hey, swear me an oath that you're not going to lie to us anymore and that you're going to treat us well. Because the two times he's dealt with him, first time he lied to him, and then as a result he was treated terribly by Abraham's God. I mean, in a sense, he had this plague brought upon his house because of the deception of Abraham. And God did that to his home. So it's kind of a this is what Abraham is, how Abimelech thinks of Abraham. Now, despite the shady and untruthful actions of Abraham, God had in fact chosen Abraham to be a source of blessing to others and not a source of cursing. So God was not willing for things to end that way with Abraham and Abimelech. And so God told Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20 to ask Abraham to pray to God for the plague on his house to stop. And so we see that in Genesis chapter 20. In verse 6, then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. Right? Go seek him, and he'll provide you with this blessing. Even though he's messed up and he lied to you, go ask him. He speaks for me. I'm with him, and he will pray to me for you, and you and your house will be healed. God also threatened Abimelech, though. You might think Abimelech might be kind of like Pharaoh here and say, I'm not gonna let her go. He lied, I've got her, that's his problem. I've got her now. But God threatened Abimelech with death if he would refuse. He said, but if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So God threatened Abimelech with death if he were to refuse to ask Abraham to do this, and if he would refuse to give Sarah back to Abraham. So God meant business. He will be a source of blessing to you, Abimelech. He will. And if you regard him lightly, I'm going to curse you. What a thing. This is an exact fulfillment of what God had promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 that he would do. So now we come to this third encounter between these men. This time Abraham has been living outside of Gerar for these 3-4 years. And his life has been witnessed by the Philistine for about that time, for those 4 years. Now, think of that now. He's been living outside their city, kind of in the hills and the surrounding country, pitching his tent and raising his flocks and his herds for about 4 years. And what do we read? And he said to Abraham, what's his conclusion? God is with you in all that you do. God is with you in all that you do. Notice first that this was witnessed by Abimelech concerning his life. God had blessed Abraham in every endeavor that he made. That's amazing. He has had tremendous fortune due to having the help of God. In all that he does, God is with him, he says. That's a remarkable statement to be made about anyone at any time. Now we just saw in Genesis 21 that it was made about Ishmael. Verse 20, and God was with the boy, and he grew up. Right? God had promised Abraham that he would support Ishmael, and that Ishmael would grow up to be a great nation. And what do we find? God, in fulfillment of that promise, God was with him. God made sure that it happened. And also in a similar way, God is with Abraham, so that everything that he does succeeds. It's quite a thing. It ought to make us think about the first call God made to Abraham. And remember this, back when he was called Abram, when he was living in Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Way back then, at that time, God said, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Here was a man named Abimelech who had witnessed Abraham's life for 4 years, and his conclusion is that God is with him and is blessing him and is making him succeed in all that he does. This man has the blessing of God. So God, in Genesis 12, God says, you come out into the land and I'm going to bless you. And then we find, some 25 years later or so, Abimelech looks at Abraham and says, I've known this guy for 4 years, and God is with him in everything that he does. God is blessing this man. He sees that. So mark that down, right? God is, in fact, fulfilling this promise. God is blessing Abraham, and Abimelech says so. Abraham is known for having the help of God, and that God is with him to protect him and to give him success. It's known by Abimelech, king of these Philistines, that Abraham is God's man. Remember, he already told him that. He said, look, he's a prophet of mine. He's a prophet. He'll pray for you. What else is known by Abimelech? God protects Abraham. Even when Abraham does wrong, God protects him. I mean, right? Abraham and Sarah lied about their relationship. Abimelech took Sarah. Now, Abraham is without a wife. He had a wife, but he lost her. Who did he lose her to? To Abimelech. So what does God do to Abimelech? He curses the house. And Abimelech says, I didn't know. God says, it doesn't matter. I know you did it in the integrity of your heart. I know you didn't realize, but you still got her, and you better return her, or I'm going to kill you. And you also need to ask him to pray to me to remove the curse, or it's going to be there forever. I mean, if you're Abimelech, you don't touch Abraham because of what God may do. So he's hands off. You can't touch him. No matter what he does, no matter how dishonest he might be in the future, it doesn't matter. Don't go near this guy because he's God's man. God's got his mark on him. God's protecting him in this way. So he knows that God will protect him. But he also knows that God's given him all this success. I mean, when we don't get rain for a while and our guys can't find any water, Abraham's got water. What's going on? How come? Why is it his flocks are just multiplying and doing so well out there? Everywhere he goes, there's always food wherever he goes. Our guys go out there, they can't find these things. What's going on? The wild animals aren't bothering his flocks. Why ours? Why do his shepherds always laughing and carrying on, and ours are coming in dejected and having lost more sheep? And what is happening? God is with him, and we can't touch him. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, there's something else he knows about Abraham from his past experience. The only opinion he has of Abraham, other than the reports that he hears and the blessing that he sees, is that Abraham can't necessarily be trusted. Right? I mean, he's kind of shady. He'll stretch the truth. Right? She's my sister. Well, she's kind of my sister. Sort of. It's convenient. We'll cast the truth in that light today because it helps us. This is what Abraham was like, according to Abimelech. It was his character. He can't necessarily be trusted. His lie in the past was a painful and costly one for Abimelech and for his people. So the continued success of this kind of not very trustworthy guy out surrounding our city, in the surrounding region, and his growing flocks and his growing herds and the amassing of his servants and the way he seems to have success whenever we have difficult seasons, all of that serves to make Abimelech and those that are with him a bit nervous about the changing dynamics of power and wealth in the area. It's like Abraham and all the wealth that he has kind of keeps increasing, and they're just kind of trying to maintain. Wherever there's a trade, it seems like a fair trade, and then afterwards you're like, wait a minute, Abraham came out better. Or you think you've duped him, and then, dang it, he actually got the better end of the deal. No matter what happens, Abraham is always coming out ahead. And we don't really trust this guy. He's not really been straight with us before. And so it's making us pretty nervous. So what does he say? Verse 23. He does what any good king would do. He seeks the future security and the safety of his people by attempting to make a treaty with Abraham that would secure the prosperity and the peace of his people so long as Abraham was in the region. He tries to neutralize Abraham as a threat to them. Notice what he seeks. Verse 23. Now therefore swear to me here by God, that is by your God, that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal kindly with me and with the land where you have sojourned. So his intention then is to come out to Abraham with the commander of his army, try to put a little muscle behind this request, force Abraham's hand if you can a little bit. So you got to be careful because it can't be seen as a threat because God may come get you, right? So it's a delicate situation. So you come out there. His intention is to secure a lasting and mutual covenant of peace between all of his people and Abraham. But he's also seeking a mutual covenant of truthfulness. Notice he says the first thing is, swear to me here by God that you'll not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. So don't lie to me about anything anymore. And don't lie, if I die, don't lie to my children. I want them safe from you. And I also want all the people that are with me, that have ordered themselves under my kingship. I want us all to know that you'll be honest with us and truthful to us. Swear an oath. Now Jesus says you shouldn't be swearing oaths. You should let your yes be yes and your no be no. You should speak in such a way that when you talk, people take it as truth. But Abraham's lost that with this man because of his lies. And so this man says, swear an oath. Let's make a covenant. Swear to me right here, by God, who's the one protecting you and not letting me harm you, and giving you all the success, swear by him, because I know you don't want to lose his protection and his favor. Swear by God that you won't deal falsely with me. And so this is the idea that if Abraham, in Abimelech and Phichol's mind, if Abraham goes back on this and reneges, then his own God is going to be angry with him. And he won't have the protection of his God anymore. It's like you win. It's a win-win. Either he's going to be faithful and honest to you, or he's not going to be, and then you don't have to worry about God protecting him from you. So you can go get him. And so this is kind of their way to make sure that Abraham's going to have to deal honestly with them. It's a good plan, I suppose. So this is what they're after. So long as Abraham is out there in the land surrounding Gerar, having the sort of success he is having, and so long as God is with him to protect him and to bless him, there's nothing the Philistines can do about him but to make peace with him and to ensure their future security against this potential threat named Abraham. They don't know what his intentions are. The fact that Abimelech would see Abraham in this way, it's kind of both good and bad. It's bad in that Abraham did not at this time have a pristine reputation. That's not good. His failings had tarnished the good name he was supposed to have. But it's good in that we see that God has been with him to make his name great and to be a blessing. According to the original call of God to Abraham, it now falls on Abraham to seek to be a blessing to Abimelech, right? If God has blessed Abraham, what's Abraham supposed to do? He's supposed to be a blessing to others. So, it's good. God has been blessing Abraham. This is wonderful to see. Now Abimelech comes and says, we want peace. What will Abraham do? Will he seek to be a blessing? Or won't he? And what does he do? He says, I will swear. He does. He seeks to be this blessing. Right? Verse 24, and Abraham said, I will swear. Abraham agrees to make a covenant with Abimelech according to these terms, essentially saying this: I promise to always be truthful to you and your people, and I promise to always treat you kindly and fairly, just as you have treated me, and agree to treat me still. It was a mutual covenant of peace. Right? But there is this condition. Something needs to be cleared first. Before we say we agree to treating each other as the status quo has been, Abimelech, you need to understand some things that have been going on. You're worried about me treating you falsely, and that happened 4 years ago, and I don't deny that. But there's some things that are more recent in our history that need to be discussed. And this is what comes up here. Before that covenant treaty can be sworn and ratified, there's something that Abraham must bring up which has been a source of strife between his servants and Abimelech's people. The issue has to do with the wells that Abraham's servants have been wisely digging in the surrounding areas. They're not necessarily wells the way we think of them, like a big hole with a bucket you pull out. I mean, they could be that, but very probably they are cisterns, like you have maybe a hillside where water, when it does rain, rains down and goes down the hillside, and you want to not just let that go to waste, so you channel it in and you dig a cistern or a well, and the water comes in and you have water when there's not rain. You have this little pond that you kind of made in there, this little cistern where it holds water, and you can go and water your animals. And that's what these are, more than likely. Let me demonstrate that for you just briefly and say a couple other things. If you turn with me to Genesis 26, you'll find these same Philistines doing something later to Abraham's son, to Isaac. Genesis 26 and verse 12. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him. Right, so he's got the same kind of blessing that Abraham had. And the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Parentheses, verse 15. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. Think of that. Here's Abraham out in the surrounding area making improvements to the land, right? Making all these digging these wells. And these guys come in and they fill them in. Now I can tell you just chronologically, Abraham's not dead yet. He's likely moved on. He's not living in that area still. He's likely living in Hebron at the time. But nonetheless, this is what happens. They filled them all in. And you might think, well, that's dumb. Why would you fill them all in? I mean, why not take advantage of them and use them yourself? Why not seize them the way Abraham says these guys had seized the well of Beersheba? Well, the reason you fill them in is because it's not, these wells aren't really close enough for you to use all the time. The only people to use them is somebody like Abraham who wants to kind of keep staying outside of town and use the wells. And if it's a really nice place for people to do that, and then we're going to have lots of these people, these squatters out in our region, and we don't want them there being a threat to us, so we're going to fill all the wells in so that there's nothing for them. So that all the wells are close enough to us that we can use easily. And so this is the idea. And so they go and fill these things in later. So here's one that's close enough that Abimelech's servants would want it, and they took it, it says. Now, what do we say here? Why does Abraham bring this up? If Abimelech is wanting the way his people have treated Abraham until now to be the standard for their dealings, and if Abraham is expected to treat them the same way, then the way that Abraham has frequently been treated by Abimelech's people has to be addressed, right? Abimelech comes out there and maybe he's pretending, maybe he's genuine. He thinks he's kind of innocent, or ignorant, I guess, of what's been happening. But he says, he knows there's been strife, there's been problems, and they're really worried. Abimelech and his people are really worried about Abraham, and things aren't good. They're not getting good reports about what's happening. And so he goes out there and says, you're going to stop dealing falsely with us. And you're going to treat us the kind way that we've been treating you. And then Abraham says, well, okay, now wait a minute. Just so you understand, it hasn't all been kind dealings. Look, this is, for example, I have this well here, and your men took it. Right? They seized it. What happens then? Verse 26. Abraham points that out, and Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. Which sounds like what Abraham is saying, something that's happened a while back. He says, I don't know who did it. You never told me about it, and I've not learned of it until today. So Abraham's not saying last night this happened. This has happened a while back. This is the kind of thing that's been going on. Now, Abimelech, again, he says he's ignorant of it. He was innocent of this personally. He did not realize that the strife had gotten that bad. I don't assume that he's lying. Right? He might be lying here. He might have known all about it, but I don't assume that he's lying. Just because he's proven himself to be an honest man before. He had a concern for some level of righteousness in chapter 20. So he's probably generally didn't know anything about it. But I will say this. Sitting there in Gerar, as his servants would go out and take care of the sheep and had their interactions with Abraham's servants, and there was strife and problems. It got bad enough that he decided to go out there and make Abraham swear to him. He was only hearing one side of the story from his servants and from his people. Right? I mean, they go out, have dealings with Abraham, come back. You wouldn't believe that guy Abraham. He's out there, and everything's going his way. We just went in there and tried to get into this well, and there was no water there because Abraham had dug this other one, and it was full of water. I can't explain it. And this kind of thing. And this is the way it is. And so he's hearing just one side of the story. Now he hears from Abraham, and it kind of puts it all in perspective. So Abraham was basically telling him it hasn't all been one-sided. It hasn't been you guys getting the short end of the stick. We've been out here, and this is the kind of thing that's been happening. Now, what do we say? Abraham is kind of saying here, when he says in verse 25, he reproves him for this cistern, or this well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. He's kind of saying, look, you came to me and said, this is how the treaty should read. You need to treat us the way we've been treating you. And Abraham says, really? Like, are you sure? If it's going to read that way, that's going to be a problem. Now, and so Abimelech says, well, I didn't know. I didn't know that was happening. I didn't know that they were treating you that way. So let's kind of leave it. We're just going to be kind to one another. And kind of that's what happens, is they agree to make this treaty. Verse 27, so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two made a covenant. So they agree to this. They're going to covenant of peace. The terms aren't exactly spelled out for us, but it's not, you will deal kindly with me as we've been dealing kindly with you, because that's now been debunked by Abraham. Abraham has been out there for these 4 years, living under the blessing of God, but also the antagonism of the Philistines. Right? This is the way they've been. They're just like they were with Isaac later. They're kind of envious of him. They see his success. They don't like it. They're a little bit nervous about it. And they've been antagonizing him, maybe not Abimelech himself, but his servants, people that go out there. There's been this strife. There's constantly ill will towards Abraham. They come back. They have these bad reports. Abimelech finally gets bad enough. He says, we've got to make an end to this. We've got to have terms of peace. Then Abraham says, well, wait a minute. God's been with us, so we've been peaceful. You guys have been the ones taking from us. We dig a well, your men take it, seize it, claim it as their own. This has been happening again and again. So this is how it is. Abraham is willing for there to be peace on his part. He's been acting peaceably despite being wrong over this time. He had simply endured their hostility, trusting in God to support and to supply for him. Now think of that. This is encouraging. Here's Abraham, this man who, in Genesis chapter 20, did not have enough confidence in God, it seemed, at least at the time under the stress, to just trust God to protect him and to provide for him in the face of these godless people. And so he lied. But then now in chapter 21, we see that for 4 years he's been enduring the hostility of the people in the land, not complaining about it. Abimelech says, well, I didn't hear about this until today. It's not like Abraham was wrong and went immediately to Abimelech and said, you've wronged me, and you know God's with me, you better watch it. That wasn't Abraham. He just said, well, I've been wrong. Okay, they've seized it, let them have it. We're here, and God is protecting and providing for us. So it's wonderfully encouraging to think that Abraham here over these 4 years has been just enduring the hostility of the people without complaint, without retribution, but with faith and trust in God. This is where he's been. We just saw him have to send his son Ishmael away, whom he loved, trusting that God would provide for him. Where did he get the faith to trust that God will provide for Ishmael? Well, because God's been providing for him. He's been seeing it. When men come and take it, when God gives him something, like a new well, and these men take it away and steal it, he doesn't have to fight for it. Let him have it. God will keep providing for me. And then here God says, take that boy Ishmael and get rid of him. And Abraham doesn't want to do it. God says, trust me. I'll take care of him. And so he lets him go with meager provisions. He sends him away, and God does take care of him. He's learning these lessons. So this is, I think, a real revelation about Abraham's growing character. When we read, and you pay attention to the fact that Abimelech says, I have not heard of any of this until today. I didn't know anything about it. It's a real help. So, Abimelech goes out, think of this, Abimelech comes out there thinking he's got the high ground morally, seeking this covenant with him and Abraham. I know the kind of guy you are, Abraham. You've proven it in the past. And God's got your back, so there's not a whole lot I can do about it in terms of military might and force. But we've been really good to you, and there's been strife, and we want that to cease. You need to acknowledge how well we've treated you. And then Abraham comes with some testimony of his own, and Abimelech no longer has the high ground. Now it's kind of an even playing field, or maybe Abraham, at least in terms of recent history, now Abraham has the high ground. You guys have been mistreating us, not the other way around. And so the tables have been turned here. Abraham could have forced the issue and wanted different terms, wanted him to make restitution and things like this, or who knows what he could have done. Could have said, you just go stay in your town there, and I'm going to stay out here. Could have done a lot of things. But he was gracious. Look at this. I mean, Abraham just lodged this complaint, and Abimelech's case is just shattered. It kind of, instead of thinking that Abimelech's side has all been good, instead they're at fault, and there's not really peace between them, and there may not be peace between them. What's Abraham going to do? Abraham, what does he do? He takes the sheep and the oxen and gives them to Abimelech. Here's a gift from one friend to another, and the two make a covenant. Right? He didn't have to do that, but he does that. This incredible gesture of friendship, which kind of seals the covenant. Now, what else does Abraham do? Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. So he takes his flock and finds these 7 lambs, these good lambs, the choice lambs, and sets them apart for what? What does Abimelech say? What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And Abraham says, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Right? That's what he says. These are a testament, right? You're going to take it, now that I have dealt kindly with you and we've agreed to this covenant of peace and to truthfulness, then against what your servants have said, you're going to take my word for it that I dug this well. And as a testimony to that, I'm going to give you these 7 ewe lambs just so that you're not out of anything. Here, I'm providing these for you. We're even. But I dug this well, and that's the truth. And so if this guy takes them, he's got to acknowledge that Abraham's being truthful and say, Abraham's telling the truth, my servants lied to me. But he's also saying, but Abraham and I are on good terms and we're friends. That's what he does. Therefore, verse 31, that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So this is what happens. So you see Abraham here not only having endured the hostility of these people during this time, but then when kind of all bets are off about this being a covenant, Abraham takes the initiative and go ahead. You might think Abimelech would say, here, go get some lambs. This guy's kind of offended. Give some oxen and some sheep and give them to Abraham as an expression of friendship that we can still make the covenant. But Abraham does it, which is huge. I mean, he's just gracious to him. He wants to. Abraham was sought for terms of peace. Abraham brought up that there really hadn't been peace until now. If they want peace, that's fine, but there hasn't been peace. Abimelech doesn't know what to do. Abraham pursues peace, pursues this covenant that they might have a relationship where Abimelech and his people can be blessed. Right? God called him. God blessed Abraham. Told him to go be a blessing to others. The situation comes up. Abimelech wants peace. But he doesn't realize that he's really at fault for there not being peace right now. Once it's brought up, Abimelech doesn't really know what to do. And Abraham says, no, there'll be peace. Don't worry. Let's make the covenant. Here. Let's be friends. Let's make this work. So he takes the initiative here, and it's wonderful to see the kind of man that Abraham is at this time. And then he goes a step further, right? He's got a reputation with this guy as a bit of a liar and a deceiver. That can't stand either. So he does this. Here's these 7 new lambs. You're going to take them from my hand as a witness that I'm telling you the truth. And on the basis of our friendship and this covenant we swore, I'm telling you, this is true. This is real. Right? What do you do when you try to tell somebody something they don't believe you? You swear an oath. And that's what he does. And he gives a gift on top of it. This is the testament. This is the testimony. We've made this oath to be truthful to one another, and I'm telling you, in light of that, I dug this well. You've got to believe me. But I don't want you to be put out. I don't want you to feel that you've just taken my word for it and maybe lost something. Here, take these 7 choice lambs. He does right by you. Abimelech has no complaint. These 7 new lambs you will take from my hand, that this will be maybe a witness for me that I dug this well. Verse 31, what does it say? Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. Now, scholars will differ on this back and forth, that you may have a note that says Beersheba means well of 7 or well of the oath. And technically it kind of mean either. The words are, we're talking about the same thing here. But in context, you could read it maybe either way. You could say, verse 29, and the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs, that's 7. Verse 30, these 7 ewe lambs. And therefore the place was called Beersheba because there both of them swore an oath. They swore an oath about this having to do with these 7 ewe lambs. And that would be fine, the well of the 7. But I tend to read it the other way, well of the oath, simply because it says, therefore that place was called Beersheba because there both of them swore an oath. It just seems like it's tied to the oath part of things, this oath. But regardless, it's the same. We know the oath that they're talking about. This oath that had to do with these 7 ewe lambs and the covenant of peace that they made and truthfulness. Verse 32. So, this is the conclusion here, wrapping things up, verses 32 through 34. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Verse 33. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Now this is key. First time in Scripture God has been called the everlasting God. Right? El Olam. So why does Abraham call him that? And he plants a tree. What is the significance of that? I mean, it's not Johnny Appleseed. The story of Abraham's life is not that he went around planting trees. Right? So that's not, we're not just being told that. There's some significance to that. Well, I'll say this. He calls him the everlasting God. I think that might say, is he looking back at all the things that God has done to him or for him and saying, well, he's the everlasting God? Or is he looking forward saying he's the everlasting God? Like he will, is it a hope that he has that he's the everlasting God? Or is it just testifying to what God has done in the past? Maybe both. But let me just kind of look at it from both perspectives. If he's looking back, I think the idea would be this. And I trust you've seen some of this as I have worked through the text. That when God first called him, he was a pagan and knew not who was calling him. He just knew he was a living God. And he went out after him. And this God had promised, I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. And you need to go be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Abraham, for the most part, most of the years he's been out here in the land, he's not seen any of that. But he's really beginning to now. I mean, he's seen sometimes, he's seen God bless him and have his hand upon him at times. He has experienced the help of God in that way. But he never had a child until he had Ishmael. And then that wasn't really the right way, and it was just all kinds of strife and problem. And Ishmael was not really a source of blessing in their home, even though they thought of him maybe as, this is God's blessing for us. But it was a lot of hardship. His hand was against everyone, and everyone's hand was against him. That was the nature of Ishmael. And it didn't seem much like a blessing. And then you've got this son, Isaac, who's born, and then Ishmael has to get sent out. But you have this boy, and he's weaned, and you love him, and the promises of God are with him. And then you have this man Abimelech who has witnessed now for 4 years. God has been with you and blessing you, giving you security, giving you success. And you've got a name. While you've tarnished that name in some ways, God is, in whatever respect you were considered great, is because God has blessed you and given you this great name. God is with you. And that's seen too. And so some of these things are really beginning to materialize in his life. God said, I'll give you this land, and he doesn't have anything. He doesn't even have a well. These guys take everything from him, and now he's got that too. It's acknowledged by the people. This is yours. Okay, this is all beginning to come together. And so he can look back and think about his own life and his history. Sarah and I have doubted. We have failed many times. We've thrown it away on certain occasions. We've been untrue. But he's been true. He's been faithful. Right? He has upheld his purposes firm and made them come to pass. He's everlasting. He promised me back in Ur, this is what he was going to do if I'd come. And he's been faithful, like he's done it. All the things we failed to do, his purposes are everlasting. This God is everlasting. He's true, He's to be depended upon. He's the everlasting God. Right? If he's looking back, he means those things. What if he's looking forward? I tend to think he's looking forward because he planted a tree. He didn't build an altar and say, God has brought me this far. This happened so I can always remember what God has done. He planted a tree. You don't plant trees where you're never going to be again. Right? But when you plant a tree, you're essentially looking forward. You're hopeful about what's going to come. And so, I don't know anyone who, when they get ready to sell a house, they plant a bunch of trees. They might plant some landscaping so it looks better, but they don't plant trees. They plant trees when they buy the house to live there, thinking in 20 years, this tree's really going to be something. You plant trees looking forward. I think the idea is this, that God has provided him with water even here in the wilderness. God will continue to provide for him. God will provide for this tree. It's going to grow out here in the middle of nowhere because God's provided. Look at this well here. It's going to work. God's going to keep providing for me. I'm going to keep worshiping him. He says, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. God will keep providing for me. I will keep worshiping God. God has upheld his promises and his purposes so far. He will continue to uphold them. His purpose, or he is resolute in his purpose. All my failings didn't matter, and I know God's going to continue to count me righteous by believing in him. Like it's going to work. It's going to come to pass. He will be this way forever. God's not going to change. He's everlasting. Verse 34, and Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. To me, I just read 34 as another testament to what Abraham just said. He's had the help of God. He says, he calls on the name of the Lord, who is the everlasting God, and what happens? He lives there for many days. God is with him for many days. And this, just like Abraham said, he's everlasting. For many days he was able to stay there because God is everlasting. That's why. Now, just to conclude, I want to read a couple texts to take this thought on and just kind of to apply it more. I'll say this, we can, as believers, be so very thankful that the Lord is the everlasting God. Think of this, it was more than 1,000 years between Abraham and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now in the next chapter, chapter 22, we're going to read where God promises to Abraham that he's going to have a son. One of his descendants would in fact bring blessing to the nations. A specific son. And more than 1,000 years goes by. And God is still everlasting in that purpose. Like he didn't change. He didn't change his mind. It took 1,000 years. 1,000, think of that. 1,000 years to come to pass. But he's everlasting. We can be thankful for that. This worldwide blessing came through this son. What about him? What about this son? Hebrews 13, verse 8. What do we say? What does the scripture tell us? Jesus Christ, the Son, is the same yesterday and today and forever. He's everlasting. Right? God is the everlasting God. Micah chapter 3 and verse 6. You remember this famous text? I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you're not consumed. For I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed. In the days of your fathers you turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Why aren't they consumed? Because of this everlasting, because he's the everlasting God and he has these purposes. He meant to bring through these people a child of Abraham who would bless the world. And so he's resolute in his purposes. He's everlasting. I don't change, therefore you're not consumed, though you deserve it. It's wonderful. Philippians 1:6, famous text, same theme, but applied to us very directly. Paul says this, and I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. How can he be sure of that? I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. That's based on a lot of things, but fundamentally it's based on this, that he's an everlasting God. It's going to come to pass. He's not going to leave it. Right? These are his purposes. He's everlasting. The one who's at work in you isn't going to die. He's not going to go away. He's not going to change his mind. He's everlasting. Abraham says this based on his personal experience. Think of this now. Think about the times. I mean, twice now he's got a promise from God that he'd have a descendant, and he gave his wife away and lost her. Maybe forever. He's had times where there were invading armies coming after him. He's had times where he's felt like the whole place was godless and didn't know how he could live there. He's moved because of his fear of some people, only to land in another place and be equally afraid that they were godless. He's been out there living in tents, not wandering around from place to place, not really, kind of welcome, but not really welcome, for 25 years now. What's he supposed to do? Or for 30 years now, sorry, for 30 years. This is the way it's been. Got nothing but the promises of God. And that's been enough. He can look back at this time and say, and build this altar and worship God, call upon his name as the everlasting God. He's provided for him. He's been true to his word. He's done all that he's promised he would do. It's all coming to pass. He can see it now. Instead of just saying, well, one day maybe God will finally start to do these things he's promised, he's seeing them come to fruition. These things are happening. And it causes him to give God a new name that he's never given him before. The everlasting God. You might just look back in your own life and say, when does that happen? When has it been? I've been with God, I've been walking with God, I've known God, but then God's brought me through some experience and it's been all new. I've seen God in a different way. I've had new things to be thankful to God for. And this is what happens to Abraham in this scene. And it's this mundane scene. It's like, we read it and think, oh, it's just this treaty between him and Abimelech, and it's kind of confusing. It causes Abraham to bow and worship to God with new thoughts about God, with a fresh revelation, with a deeper sense of appreciation for who God is and the faithfulness of God to him. It gives him a new name, the everlasting God. It's not a dull scene. It's a cause for Abraham to worship. And it ought to be a cause for us to worship too. To see God's faithfulness to him all through this. It's kind of like Abraham is summing things up. This is what God has done for me so far. What would I say about him? What would I call him? What do I think of him? Well, he's everlasting. That's his summation of God's dealings with him, and his faithfulness to him, and his care. He's everlasting. God endured it all and will endure it all. His purposes remain true. He's been so good to me. He's everlasting. And he's not, this isn't a doctrinal statement made about God. That's the only other thing I want to say about this. He doesn't, in fact, he even calls upon, it says, when he calls upon the name of the Lord, that's translated, that's Yahweh. Now when Abimelech says, swear by God, he uses the word Elohim. Swear by God, the great God who's protecting you. Swear by him. When Abraham goes to worship, he worships he calls upon the name of Yahweh, the name of this personal God who called him out of the land. The individual, you might say, put it that way, the person who met him in Ur of the Chaldeans and said, if you go do this, this is what I'm going to do. And he turns now to speak to that individual and says, you're everlasting. It's like the friend you have when all the other friends just left and would have nothing to do with you. The one who stuck with you and stayed and was faithful. That's your everlasting friend. This is the everlasting God. This is the way he means it. It's not just a cold doctrinal thing. God is eternal. That's not what he means. He knew, like if this is the God of heaven and earth who made all things, he knows it's eternal. The point is, he's everlasting. Like in relationship with Abraham, he's everlasting. This is true, therefore, we can read things later like, and Jesus could refer to it, but later we read, he is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It's not the God of the dead, but of the living, right? Way after Abraham's dead and gone, Jesus is saying, he still is God. They're still in relationship. They're still together. God is still His God, even after death. There's a consciousness and awareness between Abraham and God. They're still friends. God's everlasting. It's quite a thing. This is a personal testimony. Right? We do this sometimes, right? We share testimonies with one another. And Abraham is saying here, let me tell you about God. There's one word I could use to describe God and His dealings with me and all that I've learned about Him. He's everlasting. He doesn't fail. The thing that He promised me He would do, He's done. He said He'd be with me, and He has been. He said He would use me to bless the nations, and He is doing it. He said He'd give me a great name, and I've ruined it, but He gave it to me. I don't know what else to say, but He's everlasting. It's a name that God earns over time with Abraham. It's Abraham's personal conviction about the nature of the God that he serves. It's a relational term, not a doctrinal term. He's not called the great God in this sense. He's called the everlasting God in this scene. So, the encouraging part of all this is, again, here's a man, here's the father of the faith, and he's just saying it. When I think of God in my own experience, He's everlasting. He's true. He's faithful. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Right? That's his testimony. God had a purpose for him and a plan for him, and as much as Abraham failed and screwed things up, God proved reliable. Steadfast is the everlasting God. This is how a man is built. This is how God builds a man into the kind of man who has enough confidence in God that he does what we find in Genesis 22, where he says he obeys God. He follows through. He's convinced God is an everlasting God. Whatever comes, God will remain true to His promises. We look at Abraham and we say, I don't know if I could ever have faith to believe God the way Abraham believed God. But you've got to get to the place where you say on your own personal experience, He's the everlasting God. You see, if you call on the name of the Lord the way Abraham calls on the name of the Lord, you do the things he was doing. You have that kind of faith. Because he was convinced in the kind of God that God is. If he had lower thoughts of God, I mean, you tell me, if he didn't think God was an everlasting God, would he have been able to believe that he would receive Isaac back from the dead? Probably not. I mean, the last time he thought he had a son of promise, it wasn't the right one. Maybe it's not Isaac either. I don't know. I mean, he just would be doubting God, but he wasn't. He said, God said, it's through Isaac your offspring shall be named. God said the blessing was going to come, going to pass to Isaac. It's going to be Isaac. Isaac's the one. And he's got confidence in the everlasting nature of God. So coming to these convictions gave him strength and faith for what would come later too. It's a wonderful text. It's wonderful just to see where Abraham is in all of this, where his heart is and what God is doing in his life, how God has brought him this far. Well, those are, I feel like this is kind of, it's the last kind of thing to set the stage for what happens in Genesis 22. And it shows us so much about Abraham's growth in the Lord. Are there questions or comments on any of this